All right, I see people logging on. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So, Greg, it seems to me that there's the possibility of rumor spreading even faster than in the past. Have you been thinking about that as well when you see the way news travels these days?
Yeah, I certainly have. Thanks for that question. It's I mean, there used to be a debate over whether rumor had to be oral, person to person, and of course that's not true. It's always been possible to spread rumors through written media, and of course now with the internet and social media, rumor spreads remarkably fast, faster than ever. But what's I think very relevant to today's discussion is that it also tends to spread through certain types of social media and through certain groups, certain media communities. So since we are algorithmically sorted into our various communities online,
Right.
which discern our political points of view and our preferences, religious, even ethnic, and the way the news flows, this false news as well as true news flows through the social media is just astonishing. But I think it does conform to what's happened in the past. It's just accelerated.
Yeah, I can't remember. You were mentioning one of another scholar of rumor, and I don't remember now who it was, who talked about how important those groupings are, that it's not necessarily the game of telephone that we think of, but more importantly, the group.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's been a discussion. So it's a debate. It's been a debate, but very much the child's game of telephone is one way of thinking about rumor and the deterioration of information along that child's game of telephone. But actually, when you doesn't take much thought to just realize, no, rumor happens in communities of people and groups of people, and people discuss it. It goes back and forth. The news doesn't so much deteriorate as new information gets added on. It gets reshaped. And sometimes it just gets reinforced. So yeah, communities are very important. And many scholars have talked about that. I'll be referring to two of them today, Mark Block and Tomatsu Shibutani.
Right, right. Yeah. So I thought that was interesting food for thought because, yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that way so much. I just launched a poll that everybody can take a look at, just giving you some food for thought about some scenarios involving rumor, and let us know which ones you think happened, or maybe you even know, and it'll be interesting to discuss this as we move along. But just, a little teaser to think about the kinds of rumors that have been out there and what may or may not have been done with them. I see people signing in from all over, and Barbara Prince has a good point. Here in Ann Arbor and surrounding areas in Michigan, it is really blustery. So I agree. I hope we don't have any power outages or little blips, but just in case it happens, we'll sign back in and it'll be great. So feel free to keep that in mind. And let us know where you're signing in from. Ooh, I see somebody from Seattle. So you got up early. We appreciate that. We love it when people join us in the live discussion. So thank you. Uh-oh. And Robert's saying that Chicago got the high winds yesterday, and so he's sent them on to us today. We're coming up on 10 o'clock, so I am going to go ahead and share my screen and start us off with some initial welcome information while we get settled. Please take a moment to take the poll as you settle in and continue to participate in the chat. We appreciate that. We love that through Zoom, we can at least get a little bit of that feeling of camaraderie. And we also enjoy that you're able to join us from across the country and across the world. So thank you so much for being here. Welcome. I'm Angela Unk. I'm Director of Development at the Clements Library, and this is our 42nd episode of the Clements Bookworm. I just want to give you a couple of hints in case you haven't joined us for a bookworm before. I know many people are now feeling very familiar with Zoom, but we do indeed enjoy using the chat function. My colleague Anne will be sharing links and pertinent information along the way. And we appreciate it if you join in as well and change the setting to everyone so that we can all see your comments. However, as we go along, if you have a specific question for Professor Dowd, please put it in the Q&A section. That keeps them together so that we can find them later. And it also affords the opportunity for you to see the questions that others are asking, and you can give them a thumbs up if it's a question you have as well. That will reprioritize the questions in the order of most wanted. In addition, as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion program, we have our live machine captioning turned on today. You'll see the live transcript button somewhere on your screen where you can toggle those transcripts on or off or change the size as needed. And we also can only control so much of what you see. So please play around with it a little bit. You should have the option, I have it enabled for side-by-side mode so that you can see the speaker and the slides. You can move the separator to change the relative size of each. And you can also zoom in and out as the slides are presented. So I hope those are some helpful tips. Today's program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. We have a poll question this morning to give you a little teaser of what's coming up. And if you haven't had a chance to participate, click very quickly because I'm going to discuss the answers. Our question this morning is, which of these scenarios involving rumor actually happened? And I'll share the results. And people, I think, are on the right track, right, Greg?
Yeah, we're on the right track. Yeah.
Yes. So these are some of the rumors that are discussed in Greg's books. And so I'll just tell you that A, C, and D did happen and B did not. But all of these scenarios involve rumors that circulated.
Yeah, and even B had a kernel of truth in it. So,
Well,
because
that's a good point too, right?
yeah,
Ah,
yeah,
yes.
because there was gold, actually, it turned out.
All right. I'm going to stop sharing and say thank you to the Alumni Association. They have sponsored today's episode, and we appreciate their partnership and willingness to support programs like these. Thank you very much to the Alumni Association, and go Blue. I'm really excited to welcome Gregory Dowd to the program. Professor Dowd has published several books and many articles on the history of Eastern North America from the 16th to the mid-19th century. His scholarly interests include the study of rumor, religion, law, and those other places where ideas and popular action meet. Greg is the Helen Hornbeck Tanner Collegiate Professor of American Culture in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan, as well as a member of the Clements Library's Committee of Management. Today, Greg will be talking about his book, Groundless: Rumors, Legends, and Hoaxes on the Early American Frontier. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So one of the things that our audience is always interested in, and I thought might be a nice start to your presentation, is how does a visit to an archive like the Clements Library lead to a book project?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you how it happened with this book. And that's because I was working on other books, and I had been working on my first book and my second book, which dealt with Indigenous, British, and early U.S. relations. But one of the huge questions that just faces all of us as we sit in a place like the Clements, as we read through the manuscripts, we read through the Littleton papers or the Gage papers or the Amherst papers or Carlton manuscripts, we realize that we're trying to get at what Indigenous nations were doing, what Indigenous individuals were doing, but we're reading colonial sources. And there are other ways of getting at it, but it's still the large problem is a lot of what we're using is hearsay. It's secondhand information. And, historians are rightly always skeptical of secondhand information. We want it to be as direct as possible. And so I thought, as I was doing that over the years, it occurred to me that maybe that's the problem I should actually write about next is information, is uncertain information. And since that's what I live with as a scholar. And so that I decided to make that the center of an analysis of the frontier, and when I say frontier, I mean, relations, this zone of relations between Indigenous people and colonizers. So that's how working in a place like the Clements, reading the very hand of major colonizers like Jeffrey Amherst. How do you get at the Indigenous voices behind it?
Right. Oh, yes. And so I know that you're going to tell us one of the stories that's sort of held in the book, and then
Yeah,
talk a little bit more about the scholarship around that as well, right?
yeah.
Excellent. Well, take it away. I can't
Okay.
wait.
All right. Okay, I'd like to begin first of all by welcoming you and thanking you all for being here, and showing you just the method to my madness in this lecture, just so you see, so that you can follow it more clearly. And so I just want to show you a few things to start. I will be referring now and then to this outline, which is an outline of the lecture. So this slide isn't where we are at the lecture, it's the whole lecture. But if you want to follow where we are in the lecture, look for the asterisk. There'll be an asterisk that will show you where we are. And here it's at number 1 at the top. I will also be referring now and then to this map, which is the Jefferson map, but not Thomas Jefferson, but Joshua Jefferson map from the 1750s. There is a copy in the Clements. And I will be zooming in on this map, and the places that we'll be noting, the key places in this lecture are Winchester, or Fort Loudon, which was at Winchester. It had previously been called Fredericktown, but it was known as Winchester by this period, the 1750s. Also Fort Cumberland in what's now Maryland and was then Maryland, although that was in dispute, on the Potomac River. And Fort Duquesne, which is now Pittsburgh, later it was Fort Pitt, after being Fort Duquesne, at the juncture of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers. So I just want to orient you in this way. So now I'll start. The young colonel, wary of false alarms, heard the ring of truth in the reports. Some 2,000 enemy French and indigenous men had rendezvoused at Fort Duquesne, now Pittsburgh, on the Ohio River, and they marched his way. The powerful expedition had already crossed the Monongahela River, past the site of General Edward Braddock's infamous 1755 defeat, which the colonel remembered all too well. A veteran of that disaster, he could imagine French men straining at heavy artillery as they lumbered with an indigenous guard across the Alleghenies. Such a force would make quick work of Fort Cumberland, a weak outpost on the Maryland frontier. All signs indicated that the enemy thousands would next hit his own station, Fort Loudon. The enemy, wrote the colonel, are bringing howitzers with them for the easier reduction of the place. The cunning foe, advancing in thousands, threatened destruction to the unconscionably weak colonies. Looking upon his current intelligence as of utmost importance, young George Washington forwarded copies to the governor, and he called a council of war. He had precise details. A party of 6 British allied Cherokees had gone toward Fort Duquesne, along with 14 other indigenous intelligence gatherers and 10 Virginia regimentals under Captain Robert Spotswood. The 6 Cherokee men had boldly spied ahead toward Fort Duquesne, the bustling regional hub of enemy military operations. In extreme danger, these Cherokee spies saw the enemy preparing the carriage of mortars. The mortars were so large, they were said to have reported that a fawn could sleep in each weapon's gaping mouth. Before returning to British Fort Cumberland, the 6 men came under attack. 3 of these Cherokees took bullets, but all of them lived to breathe the bad news of an impending assault. Washington carefully examined the intelligence at his disposal. The enemy force would crush Fort Cumberland, but with men from neighboring counties, Washington might defend Fort Loudon. He sounded the alarm to area militia lieutenants at Fairfax, Fort Prince William, and Culpeper counties, adding, "The truth of the report is, I believe, unquestionable." "I believe," he said, taking faith in the reports. But faith often admits doubt, and young Washington left that door ajar with the word "if." "If the enemy are coming down," he wrote, and notably, "if the Indian intelligence may be relied on." A responsible officer, Washington informed his superiors of contradictory evidence. A French prisoner taken near Fort Duquesne weeks earlier and by a different Cherokee party had insisted under interrogation that Fort Duquesne possessed no artillery capable of carriage across the Alleghenies. Washington knew the enemy would not attack if the prisoner's intelligence is literally to be credited, but he believed, surely it is not. Putting doubt aside, Washington instructed Major Andrew Lewis on the South Branch of the Potomac to give all the country people warning of the danger with which they were threatened, a danger he likely increased. In what historian Matthew Ward has aptly characterized as a terrible decision, young Washington ordered the consolidation of forces and the abandonment of several frontier outposts, stimulating a further evacuation of the outlying settlements. From the Alleghenies eastward to the Blue Ridge, terror swept the valleys of Virginia. The situation in 1757 did demand fear, but not because an enemy force of thousands came howling with great guns to level Virginia's fortifications. For one thing, indigenous raiders had for 2 years hit and devastated Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, the backcountry, at least, of these regions. For another, within the colonel's news lay a kernel of truth. A French and intertribal party had actually sallied out from Fort Duquesne with designs on Fort Cumberland. The force had even crested the Appalachians. The Cherokee reports anticipating this were, in that sense, pinpoint accurate, even as they reached Washington and Virginia. But just as the French prisoner had insisted, the invading force had no artillery, and what is more, or rather what is less, the entire invading force had only 200, not 2,000 men. It had no design on Winchester. Due to illness, the French in the party never made it to Fort Cumberland. Their allies, the native people, in scores, not thousands, broke up into smaller parties, which brought devastation to scattered settlements on the South Branch of the Potomac. Fort Cumberland saw no assault. Loudon had never been in danger. But the phantom force, the imagined force, wreaked havoc as backcountry settlers saw local garrisons withdrawn to protect Loudon, and as smaller enemy parties stepped up their raids on farmsteads. A genuinely dangerous place, Virginia's wartime frontier amplified news and rumor. There, uncertainty flourished. There, people needed more information than they had. There, they needed to make sense of urgent events. Washington's frontier cried out for intelligence. George Washington had acted on rumor. He further spread the rumor. He experienced rumor's grip. This is not how we genuinely view the tight-lipped man on the dollar, but he was a man. Moreover, while Washington pledged his belief in the reports, he admitted that they might be false. The very defining feature of a rumor is not its truth, but its lack of verification and its currency. A German cultural historian, Hans Joachim Neubauer, has put it this way: whether rumors are true or false counts for little. What is important is that they are up to date and that they do not hide their status as rumors. When we pass rumors, we genuinely recognize that we're passing on unverified information. So we're now at point 2 in Roman numerals. English speakers at the time, including Washington, implicitly recognized the groundless quality of rumors by calling them into question as flying reports. Indigenous peoples actually did this too. In 1768, the Pontiac, the Ottawa leader, local to my region here in Ann Arbor, would associate rumors with bad birds. South Carolina's Governor James Glenn in 1751 expressed surprise that Cherokees attended to what Glenn called groundless reports. Groundlessness, flight, these suggest not only a lack of foundation, but also speed and power. In early modern English, rumor was synonymous with uproar, tumult, and disturbance. In antiquity, Virgil noted that fama, the personification of rumor, flies and noisily cries. And this was familiar to people in the 18th century. John Dryden's 1691 verse translation of the Aeneid, which was available in the 18th century, of course, in this translation, fama is fame. And here's an image from that volume. Swift is her walk, more swift her winged haste, a monstrous phantom, horrible and vast. As many plumes as raise her lofty flight, so many piercing eyes enlarge her sight. Millions of opening mouths to fame belong, and every mouth is furnished with a tongue, and round with listening ears the flying plague is hung. She fills the peaceful universe with cries, no slumbers ever close her wakeful eyes. By day from lofty towers her head she shows, and spreads through trembling crowds disastrous news. Female, airborne, towering, powerful, fast is the goddess rumor, fama or fame. The Winchester alarm of 1757 sprang from many human sources, none of which Washington could verify. 6 unnamed Cherokee allies, having scouted near French Fort Duquesne, brought the most critical news. They had returned to Fort Cumberland with wounds and information, but they did not speak clear English, and no one at Fort Cumberland understood much Cherokee. The Cherokee men later denied, apparently through a better interpreter, having given such an account. Instead, they said they had accurately told the Cumberland officers that many large scouting parties were sent into the colonies. Washington later concluded that the commander of Fort Cumberland, Maryland's Captain John Dagworthy, had distorted the original Cherokee language or broken English report of French and indigenous commando raids into an imminent French indigenous invasion complete with howitzers. In other words, George Washington thought that the rumor arose in a great measure from a misunderstanding on the part of Captain John Dagworthy of the Cherokees, as Washington put it, for want of a proper interpreter. Now, Washington disliked Dagworthy, and the feeling was shared. The men had, just the previous year, disputed their place in the chain of command. Officers concluded that dispute in Washington's favor. They decided that Dagworthy had been in the wrong and that Washington outranked Dagworthy. Analyzing the Winchester alarm of 1757, Washington found another Dagworthy error: the failure to secure a proper interpreter. For his part, Dagworthy had another explanation. Once the alarm had passed, the older and far more seasoned captain informed the upstart 25-year-old colonel that the Cherokee scouts, these young warriors, and much frightened, had simply exaggerated, and a more experienced Cherokee party had later corrected them. One suspects the older and more experienced captain was chiding the younger Virginian. Both Washington and Dagworthy agreed, however, that bad information produced the rumor. Dagworthy blamed unreliable Cherokee perception, these untrustworthy youngsters. Washington blamed an error in translation, Dagworthy's lack of a proper interpreter. As Dagworthy understood it, if the Cherokees had only made an accurate report, no alarm would have sounded. As Washington saw it, if a proper interpreter had only been available, no panic would have spread. Both explanations, faulty perception and distortion in serial transmission, have advocates among those who would explain the phenomenon of rumor. In this view, rumors originate from a series of individual errors, flaws in initial perception, sequential failures of understanding. But how rumor assumes its shape, how it retains its sense, requires more attention to the historical, social, and cultural aspects of the social media that carry the hearsay. Errors in perception and transmission do not alone make for rumor. Whatever a rumor's inception, it needs communities of people to form and to spread. Mid-century American sociologist Tamotsu Shibutani's views might help us understand Washington's predicament in the 1750s. Shibutani posits rumor mongering as the common work of people intelligently seeking information under ambiguous circumstances. Rumor, in this generous sociological view, results from a group effort to understand unexplained events. A rumor is not an individual creation that spreads, but a collective formation that arises in the collaboration of many. Whatever its origin, it cannot thrive without the support of a group or groups of people. So now I'm on point 3. Dagworthy alike attributed the origins of false news to the report of a Cherokee party at Cumberland. But the rumor also had other more collective tributaries, just as Shibutani would have it. Washington, after all, did not meet the Cherokee men themselves until the rumor had already abated. He had the false news in a letter from Dagworthy, and he also had it from the men who carried that letter. Nor did Washington's false news reach him from Dagworthy's report alone. Other frightening tidings had hopped aboard Dagworthy's message as it sped from Cumberland to Winchester. These tidings added force to what Shibutani calls the improvised news. An unnamed soldier dispatched from Cumberland arrived in Winchester with his additional observation that the woods appear to be quite alive with enemy Indians who show themselves openly in the day. Washington passed this non-fact on to his superiors, adding his own noteworthy detail. This is unusual for them to do unless they are strong. The common soldier had seen figures in the woods. The colonel authorized those figures as harbingers of enemy arms, and he spread the news. Historian Mark Bloch and historiographer Mark Bloch long ago recognized meaning in such mistakes as those made by the Cherokee interpreters, the Cumberland captain, the unnamed soldier, and the young Colonel Washington. The interpretive work that goes into making and sustaining rumor, Bloch wrote, reshapes the unfounded information. Washington and Dagworthy, each in his own way, saw the rumor as originating in an error, but neither's mooted origin for the rumor explains how the false report of the massive invasion gained its particulars and became a resonant rumor in the population. This is especially true both of rumors that arise not from particular errors, but even from deliberate hoaxes, because rumors can originate in lies. Also, it's true of rumors that arise where there is no clear origin in an error or in a misperception or in a deliberate lie, but rather in these more general collective conversations among many. The point is that rumors to rise and flourish must accord with the understanding of those who are misinterpreting the information and discussing it among one another, among themselves. Rumoring is group work. It is also often critical in nature. And this gets us to point 5. The rumored investment of Winchester rendered multiple judgments on current affairs. Cherokee allies, British commanders, provincial governors, ordinary soldiers, common civilians, all voiced their concerns by sounding the alarm. They deplored British and provincial military ineptitude. They expressed awe at indigenous and French abilities, and they vilified Native Americans by lumping them all under the collective noun Indians, which threatened to include their bold Cherokee allies as well as their enemies. The Virginia backcountry provided excellent acoustics for rumors' amplification, and Washington contemplated this false news, and as he did so, this news of a grand invasion, as he contemplated this, it's possible that he reflected on earlier alarms that had buffeted the Winchester region. For 2 years earlier, at Winchester, during the frightening autumn of 1755, Washington encountered a panicky rumor that Native Americans were slaughtering the locals. It was false. When the dust settled, he concluded that among the sources of the panic was the ordinary workmanlike shouting of 2 resident enslaved cowherds who were bringing in livestock. Their yodeling cattle calls had morphed in settlers' ears into Algonquian war whoops, Washington concluded. Washington despaired. A panic prevails among the people. They are alarmed at the most usual and customary cries. Washington had come to Winchester to defend it against a powerful enemy. Once in town in 1755, he found himself fighting not native warriors, but Virginian fears. And now I'm moving on to part 6. His arsenal in this fight against rumor included ridicule, encouragement, and reassurance. So during this previous panic in 1755, he posted an advertisement, hoping in part to humiliate men who abandoned their farms due to the panic. Whereas diverse timorous persons run through the country and alarm its inhabitants by false reports of the Indians having attacked and destroyed the country, Washington assured readers that in a short time, the frontiers will be so well guarded that no mischief can be done, either to them or their plantations, which must, of course, be destroyed if they desert them in so shameful a manner. Fear, compounded by falsehood, was the trouble. Bravery, backed by truth, was the cure. Accurate reports would scatter rumors' dark flocks. How are authorities to confront rumor? Much 20th century American scholarship on rumor was conscious effort towards such control. American officials during the Second World War, advised by psychologists, staffed rumor clinics to circulate counter-information. Later, urban governments seeking to quell rumors that fed crowd violence in the 1960s reached for the phone, and they set up rumor hotlines so that individuals could call for the truth. These efforts to combat rumor with authorized news, a technique Washington deployed in his advertisement of 1755, suffer when rumors feed on the mistrust of authority. And that is often the case, especially in war. And that has certainly been apparent in our own time during the pandemic, when we find that many Americans with a deep mistrust for federal power do not trust the Center for Disease Control. Shibutani touched on this in his 1966 study. The development of rumors, though sometimes embarrassing and at times even disastrous, is an indication of the independent judgment and unwillingness of people to passively accept formally approved reports. If rumors are an effort to make sense of events for which well-founded information seems inadequate, to advocate skepticism about rumors, to attempt to counter them with authorized information is rarely enough. If the government is failing to protect the people, the unprotected are unlikely to trust the authorities. Washington's formal advertisement could not halt rumoring on a frontier, and particularly a frontier that had become a war front. Historian, historiographer, and importantly, First World War veteran Mark Bloch recalled the front that he had experienced during the War of 1914-1918, and he recalled it as a place where authorities held soldiers and civilians at bayonet point and where the censor plied his trade. A lot of censorship in the lines and in the trenches. But in spite of the authorities, false news flourished. The frontier, like the front, was a place where authorities were distrusted, where no one could trust authoritative news. Rumor-filled cabins, buzzed forts, and hurtled down the wagon roads. What is more, authorities participated in rumor and disinformation. Washington himself was near the front in the mid-1750s, and he could not help but join his men and the country people in the effort to find truth in what were vague and, uncertain intelligence. Even Washington's advertisement carried a whiff of doubt about the government's power to protect, for he did not promise a well-guarded frontier immediately, but in a short time. Like later authorities, Washington found rumor extremely difficult to manage. His own youthful authority weak in an age that respected age, his government apparently weak in the face of a very powerful enemy, Washington's effort to ridicule those who would rumor accomplished very little. Washington's frontier was a place where the authorities had failed. No one trusted authorized news, which was in any case rare, and rumor echoed from the Piedmont to the Appalachians. Authorities proved as susceptible to rumor as anyone else. Winchester, a key center in the grain-producing region of Virginia, located strategically along wagon roads that joined the frontier to the Piedmont and the backcountries of Virginia to those of Maryland and Pennsylvania, Winchester formed a key point of exchange, not only for goods, not only for grain, but also for talk. Washington, near that figurative frontier, near the front lines, could not help but join in the public effort to find truth in vague intelligence. The longer he remained at Winchester, the more he fell prey to rumor. By 1757, when Cherokee scouts attempted, without a proper interpreter, to provide intelligence to the garrison at Cumberland, its soldiers and officers, along with others from Cumberland to Winchester, had for years lived under the threat of war, and they had lived in a state of inquisitive alarm. When Washington and others at Winchester struggled to make sense of the Cherokees' relayed reports, they folded in other news from messengers and locals, and they engaged in the interpretive work that Shibutani found fuels rumor. Hearsay proved too strong for Washington and his countrymen in the Panic of 1757. As Mark Bloch put it in The Historian's Craft, the rumor phenomenon becomes a mirror in which the collective consciousness surveys its own features. Amid the uncertainties of 1757, a horrible year for British arms, Washington and his peers gazed unhappily into the glass. And now to point 7. By 1755, Native Americans had for decades, even generations, done little to harm the colony of Virginia, but the reverse cannot be said. And suddenly that year, colonists suffered real violence as Native Americans from the nearby Ohio Valley to the faraway Upper Great Lakes raided the backcountry. The raids continued, and the colonies failed to repel them. Indigenous success shocked the colonists. Well could the people of Winchester imagine that skillful, deadly, and merciless Native Americans had gathered in strength just beyond their detection. But the amplification of real indigenous assaults into far-flung panics of the kind that serially rocked Winchester reveals more than fear. The proliferation of these non-events, of imagined Native American assaults, of phantom enemy hordes advancing over the nearby ridges, these unveil a broad and terrified respect for Native military power. That respect had spread across the colonial landscape. Washington shared this colonial sensibility. British officers, colonial soldiers, and frontier farmers identified in generic Indians an awesome and mysterious power. Correspondents widely bruited Native Americans' superiority in the woods. And amid the frequent denigration of Native American people in the officers' writings, there appears not only a grudging admiration, but even a bewildered longing for Native Americans' desperately needed military skills. On May 20th, 1757, shortly before the panic that is the main subject of this paper erupted, the Virginia Regiment's Lieutenant James Baker and the Cherokee Nation's Swallow Warrior had led 5 regimentals and 15 Cherokee men from Fort Cumberland toward Fort Duquesne. Within 20 miles of Fort Duquesne, they caught up with a party of 10 French soldiers under 3 ensigns. In the ensuing firefight, the Anglo-Cherokee force suffered 2 serious casualties, but it overwhelmed the French. It killed 5 of them, including 2 of the officers, taking the 3rd ensign prisoner. The Cherokee leader of this group, Swallow Warrior, lay among the dead. Washington reported these facts to his superiors, and he praised the valiant Swallow Warrior, and importantly for our purposes, he acknowledged the Cherokee's skills, endurance, and loyalty. One other Indian was wounded and brought in on a bier near 100 miles by the party, who had nothing to live upon for 4 days last but wild onions. He had clear admiration for these Cherokees. Washington no doubt preferred European to Native American warfare. Still, he believed British success to depend in good measure upon Britain's indigenous allies. Only native warriors could bring intelligence of enemy movements and spread alarm through enemy ranks. Washington noted more than once, "I think these scalping parties of Indians we send out will more effectually harass the enemy by keeping them under continual alarms than any parties of white people can do." He praised Native Americans, but he spiced his praise with loathing. He called the parties we send out not scouts, not rangers, not patrols, but scalping parties, when their mission was also partly intelligence gathering, spying, the gathering of information, He considered indigenous military abilities to be great and enviable, but he also considered them to be repugnant. And it boded ill for the Cherokee-British alliance that for Washington, who is by no means alone, for him and for other British subjects, dependence on Native Americans was not only real, but shameful. Colonists had long resisted the idea of becoming too American, too Native. In the decades that preceded the Revolution, as transatlantic networks of all kinds intensified, colonists tended to develop Greater British, even more English, sensibilities, habits, and identities. And George Washington was among those. The colonists were Anglicizing. If the war gave colonists a respect for indigenous prowess, it did not inspire a desire to go native. Broadly speaking, the 7 Years' War intensified vilification of indigenous people. It intensified what would come to be known as Indian hating. 20th century sociologist Shibutani knew from hard experience gained in his early 20s as a forcibly interned American of Japanese descent, the wartime power of suspicion. In 1966, he noted that groups gripped by the uncertainties of war often describe the enemy in terms that reveal fears about their own internal divisions. Put another way, rumors of treason accompany war. When the war broke out, Virginia's rather nervous Governor Dinwiddie described Maryland's Roman Catholics as natural traitors. Pennsylvania's Germans added to Dinwiddie's suspicions. He also worried about Quakers. The possibility of a slave insurrection further fed his fears of an enemy within. And Dinwiddie was hardly alone. At Maryland's Fort Cumberland, troops arrested 2 deserters, and they quickly hanged one of them, an Irish papist who was assumed to be a spy for the French. Justly, Washington noted. Irish, German, Quaker, Catholic, the enslaved, all stood as potential enemies within. Well, such suspicion would not overlook Britain's Cherokee allies. Washington paid considerable attention to the quest for Cherokee support, and he was not alone. During the dangerous winter of 1755 to 1756, he appealed to his government for indigenous scouting parties. By 1757, as he joined in Winchester's alarm, he worked with visiting and allied Cherokees, including Ostaneco, also known as Otasiti, a leading figure in the Cherokee-British alliance, an alliance the colonel saw as well worth cultivating. For my own part, I think they are indispensably necessary in our present circumstances. In April 1758, he still saw these Cherokees as our steady friends and valuable allies. The colonial sense of indigenous power and ability, the equation of native men with stealth, speed, and intimate violence, work their way into American legend. We see them in our own time. In the Apache, Chinook, and Black Hawk helicopters that have hovered over the Middle East and Central Asia. We see them in the precision-guided Tomahawk cruise missiles that have sped to their targets. We see them in our marketing strategists' Chevy Thunderbirds, Jeep Grand Cherokees, and Dodge Dakotas. The attribution of dangerous power was already present in the 18th century, and it worked both for and against real Cherokees and the real Cherokee-British alliance in the 7 Years' War. That Cherokees endured hardship better than Britons was a backhanded compliment. The mystical abilities of indigenous allies to subsist on wild onions, though admired, identified them with the Indians, the enemy. In spite of the important alliance, rumors regarding enemy stealth resonated with rumors alleging Cherokee treachery. British colonists and Cherokees again surveyed their unsteady relationship in rumor, in groundless talk. North Carolinians and Virginians particularly rumored Cherokee outrages. Virginia's Dinwiddie wrote to Washington in the summer of 1756 of horrid murders committed in the neighborhood of Augusta, Virginia. And Washington replied in the language of rumor, by the latest advices, it is thought, note the passive construction, it is thought that these outrages were committed by the Cherokees. Dinwiddie, squaring his unreliable news with Washington's, responded, I did hear of one Cherokee's being with the other Indians, but he also understood that the party was a multi-tribal party of Allegheny Indians, a polyglot group with no real links to the Cherokee Nation. British officers heard the rumor that in early 1757, a party of 10 Cherokees had entered into discussions with the French at Fort Duquesne. The rumors that Cherokees and British colonists circulated about one another during the 7 Years' War exposed animosities that outweighed the benefits of the alliance. The rumors, sped by enormous uncertainties and a pressing need for knowledge, circulated easily among people familiar to these rumors, among people who shared the values in the medium in which the rumor circulated. George Washington and other colonists had desired Cherokee allies to meet a menacing enemy that seemed too powerful otherwise to overcome. Colonial authorities believed that Cherokees might best gain intelligence of the enemy and bring certainty to a chaotic and uncertain world. At the same time, they and other colonists increasingly despised Cherokees for being indigenous. Indians had suddenly emerged as a powerful force, native to lands that the empires meant to occupy, that administrators meant to exploit, and that the settlers meant to farm. Colonial rumors of Cherokee treachery, like colonial rumors of Indian power, revealed and shaped mentalities. On the wings of Fama, on the wings of the goddess of rumor, Great Britain's deepest and most promising alliance with Native American people spun downward into the dark valleys of the Smoky Mountains. By the end of 1759, the Cherokees and Great Britain found themselves at war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. If anyone has any questions, I'd just like to remind you to put them in the Q&A section. And I am going to do just a couple of announcements while everybody absorbs the lecture and thinks about any questions. And let's see. Here we go. Now that you are signed up for the Bookworm, you'll receive a reminder every month about the upcoming session. Our next Bookworm is on May 20th, and it'll be an author conversation with Marcy Sachs, The Importance of Companion Animals to U.S. Civil War Soldiers. So we hope that you'll have an opportunity to join us again live. And everyone who is registered will also receive an email after today's production with a link to the recording as well as any information and resources that were mentioned at the time. I'd also like to mention that we're getting back into some in-person events for those of you who are in the area or who may be visiting the area. This semester, we were happy to have a collaboration with a student class, which created a student curated exhibit, Navigating Disability in 19th Century America. That exhibit, we don't have all of our summer hours yet, so pay attention to upcoming emails about that. But we would love to have people take a look at it. There is also an online version of the exhibit for those of you who aren't able to join us. We'll be highlighting the exhibit during in-person guided tours on select afternoons. We still have room in today's session at 4:15 if anyone is looking for something to do. And we will have sessions at 4:15 on Friday, April 29th and Friday, May 6th, as well as some open exhibit browsing time from 5 to 8 p.m. on the 29th and 6th. So looking forward to seeing people in the Avenir Foundation room again and learning from this wonderful exhibit. Another in-person event, our long postponed meet and greet with Director Paul Erickson. This was originally scheduled for spring of 2020, and due to the pandemic, we were unable to hold an in-person event. I know many of you have seen Paul online at various programs that we've hosted, and now we'd like to invite you to get together with us in person at the Ann Arbor City Club on Monday, May 2nd from 5 to 7:30 p.m. For some refreshments and camaraderie, as well as some thoughts from Paul. And I'd just like to remind everyone that your gifts are so important to us. They really do help make Clements resources available for the study and exploration of history, as well as making programs like this available. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of the Bookworm, you can contact myself or Anne. And we appreciate everyone for participating in these programs and for the support that you're able to give. Now on to questions. All right. Tim is asking, within the number of documents that you researched, were there any references of a George Washington discussion of dragging canoe?
That's an interesting question. No, not George Washington, not that I know of, but that doesn't mean they're not there. So dragging canoe, I know, the great Chickamauga Cherokee leader who broke with Atakulakula in the 1770s. Yeah, that's a fascinating question. But I haven't run across a reference to dragon canoe in the George Washington papers, but I wasn't looking for it, so it's possible that he would know of dragon canoe.
All right, thank you. So Mitzi is wondering, how long did it take to recognize that the cattle calls yodeling had been mistaken for Native American uprising of sorts? What was the impact of that delay?
So I think that was actually a matter of days. I can't tell you exactly. I don't think it was a matter of weeks or months. I think it was a matter of days. But the impact was, I mean, Washington was just startled at the fear that he was encountering in the community. And so I think the impact was, at that time, he was under he really was. The difference between 1755 and 1757, in a way, is in 1755, he thought he could manage it. He thought he could just, convince people, no, this is false news. Everything's be calm. Whereas in 1757, he kind of was in it himself. But yeah, I think it was just a matter of days.
That's an interesting distinction. And I mean, you did talk about that a little bit today, but this idea of him thinking that he could manage it and that there were ways to manage the rumors. And so do you see some of that parallel today as people enter politics, that either overconfidence in being able to manage the rumors, or
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's so challenging, and it's as challenging today as it was in the 1750s. And I'm not, I don't, I hope I'm not, being hypercritical of Washington's inability here. It's a massive challenge,
right.
To gain control, and we all fall prey to it. I mean, I guess one of the things we're very critical of rumoring, and we should be. I mean, it is the spreading of false information often. But one of the things I admire about the scholar Shibutani, who I refer to, is, and of course, it was led to horrible horrors for him and his family. But he also recognizes that one of the problems is we're an intelligent species. And being intelligent, we try to make sense of everything, even when we don't have adequate information. So this is the challenge, is
right.
People who rumor falsely about, and who rumor, say in an echo chamber that is very distinct from what we think, say, the Centers for Disease Control would want us to believe, would argue. And I tend to trust them, but those people aren't unintelligent. They're highly intelligent often. They're just working with a different set of beliefs and in a different conceptual world. And that is how one manages that is the great challenge of our times, I think, actually, in
Right.
terms of information.
Yes, and certainly within other chapters of your book, we see that as well, the difficulties in managing from a upper level position.
Yeah, and one of the problems is it's also true that no one is immune. No one's immune from false information. So authorities themselves fall prey, which is part of what I try to underscore. This is a real knot. It's hard to untangle.
Right.
And I think that's why rumor does lend itself to why we see it as powerful and as fleeting and yet powerful and fast, and even the ancients saw it that way. So
Yes, indeed. So Nicholas is asking, part of your discussion on spying and George Washington reminds me of Alexander Rose's book, Washington's Spies, the Story of America's First Spy Ring. Does your research have any connection with Washington's later use of spies during the Revolutionary War?
So it doesn't, but that's a really interesting lead, and spying and intelligence gathering certainly could be another way to go with a project like this. And actually, I think this project could go out in endless directions. So I used Washington mainly in this book, just to tell you what the book is about. In this book, I focus on Washington mainly in this episode. In other episodes, I do, because the Cherokees in some ways form more of a thread than Washington does. Because in a later episode, I talk about how rumors of Cherokee involvement with Britain actually feed into that line, the last charge against the king in the Declaration of Independence. So I veer in a different direction when I head toward the American Revolution. And I sort of leave George Washington behind. But that would be, I'd love to hear more about that. I'll have to dive into it.
Thank you. And Paul is asking if you can talk about how the mode of transmission may have influenced how rumors were received and or acted on in the 18th century. Were rumors that appeared in print, i.e. in newspapers, given more credence than rumors that spread person to person, either orally or via letter?
It's hard to measure. I don't really have a way of gauging that. Clearly, the main difference would be that, that would be hard to measure. When we're trying to evaluate rumors, when people are trying to evaluate rumors, what they're looking for is what we are looking for, right? It's the source. And when they know that a rumor is groundless, when they know it's unverified, they'll still pass it on. It's still powerful because it's important. This is information that, it may be true, so we've got to share it. A newspaper is, and in the 18th century, of course, especially in the later 18th century, as we get to the highly political end of the 18th century, where newspapers were highly partisan, and then people would be looking at the paper and trying to judge the source. In this period, newspapers could be doubted too, because they were often gazettes that were sort of government information was often being fed to people, along with advertising. You didn't have journalism in the modern sense. So people understood that a correspondent wasn't a journalist. A correspondent was literally somebody who was writing a letter from the frontier. And so what was often, say, if it was information coming from the frontier, what was printed in newspapers was often a reproduction of a letter purportedly received from the interior, say. So, so I guess I'm thinking out loud as I'm answering this really interesting question.
Right.
Rumors were, newspaper reports were often just reproductions of letters. So they were often kind of the same thing. And I guess people would understand them in similar ways. I don't think I can answer the question as to whether readers would evaluate a personal letter more highly than a newspaper. It would depend on whether they trusted the source. And that's ultimately what it is. But one thing about newspapers we must remember in this period is there was no professional journalism. And of course, that's what we face right now. Is there's a great distrust in many sectors of professional journalism. And that is a major problem we face now.
Well, and and like the gazettes, now we have blogs and other smaller forms taking shape, and so there's such a variety again, I think.
Right. Yeah.
So one of the things that I was really thinking about as I read the book is, some of these ideas and definitions about rumors and hoaxes and legends and things. And I marked in, I think it's actually the introduction, this idea that rumor can evolve into legend, and legend can shape history despite the efforts of historians to ground work in good evidence. And so that's another aspect to what we were just saying here. But do you have, maybe an example of that or a thought about that?
Yeah. So Yeah, so I'm very fascinated by the problem of history. How do we do history? This is how I got into the project to begin with. The problem of sources. And one of the concerns I had, I'll give an example that from the book. We have this great mythic even episode in the 7 Years' War. So I'll say, since we're on the subject of the 7 Years' War, and that's the attack on the surrendered forces at Fort William Henry. I think 1757, same year. And so this indigenous attack on the troops who are leaving who have surrendered at Fort William Henry. And the myth, I think, that has infected history and professional history is that the indigenous attackers were infected by smallpox in the course of that very attack. In other words, and this should interest us today, given our interest in epidemics and pandemics.
Right.
And it's really not, there isn't actually terrific evidence that would say that this was the moment at which they were infected. There were plenty of other opportunities for smallpox to reach the peoples of the upper Great Lakes, which it did at the end of that year. There were a great many other opportunities for smallpox to reach them than this specific incident. And yet historians in my time have written, usually with a sense of irony, not with a sense of providential judgment, but with a sense of irony that, ironically, the indigenous peoples in this attack on the surrendered British contracted smallpox. In the late 18th century and early 19th century, this circulated as a providential judgment, as a notion of a providential judgment upon the peoples of the upper Great Lakes for attacking the surrendered garrison. And so this is a myth that has infected history. It's become a legend. It became a legend and it's infected history. We really do not know, and we should really beware of these myths that pass for history. And yet it's really hard to do because we love a good story. And a good story is shaped by the culture in which we live. And challenging that is just enormously difficult. So I hope that's a good example of a myth that is passed for history. There are many of them. I mean, right. I think and I'm sure I'm subject to them. In fact, I know I've been subject to them, that I have fallen prey myself to passed on truths and stories that I realize, on closer reflection, well, maybe we actually don't know this to be true.
And I think it points to thinking carefully about how we teach history, because I certainly know that in high school, I was taught history as facts. And so I think that certainly that kind of teaching of history continues to perpetuate those kinds of legends.
Yeah, and that's a tough balance because, of course, we do believe in facts, but
sure,
to balance between fact and interpretation, and that's difficult. And of course, teaching high school, that I think is also an enormous challenge, and I really defer to the teachers on that one. For teaching high school students, and especially younger age, at what point does one? Yeah, I mean, I deeply admire those who do that, and I wouldn't know how to approach it myself.
Oh, I agree. It's just one of those things that as I was thinking again about those definitions and then sort of thinking about how how I learned some of the historical information. I was like, we do need to be careful sometimes about how the information is presented, for
Yeah.
sure, and thinking deeply about those stories. I enjoy Paul's comment in the chat. He says Carlton Young um, sort of answers this question in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. This is the West, sir. When legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Yeah, that's right.
um, all right. So Mary Pedley has some observations about the map. And
I'm shocked.
uh, which we appreciate. She says that she appreciated the grounding of place with the Fry and Jefferson map. This map also reinforces the Anglicization of the landscape by the absence of any or little indigenous presence. And she's wondering if you looked at maps from the same period of the same area and their different point of view with regard to the indigenous groups. And then she says, a map's claim to truth often are based too on verbal reports as well as on-site observation or survey, and can be equally slippery as sources.
Yeah. So if I can broaden it out, I I do early in the book in the first chapters of the book, I examine. I noticed these maps. I'm not the first person to notice this, but these maps that have these Great Lakes in the interior of the Southern Appalachians, these large lakes that aren't there, and that are actually there are large lakes there now, but that's because of the Army Corps of Engineers. And but at the time there were not those dams. There was no Tennessee Valley Authority, and we didn't have hydroelectric, and we didn't have these large lakes in the interior. And but these were places where stories had passed on to early Spanish colonizers of the Florida area, that there had been there was gold in these lakes, and there were communities that lived near these lakes, and they harvested gold. And so the maps of the unreliable maps are a part of my earlier chapters. As for I did not make a systematic study of maps in the 1750s or 1760s to do the kind of comparison that Mary's talking about, but it could be done. It'd be a great project. Yeah, I mean, in terms of misinformation and trying to figure out, why do people believe that? How did that happen? How did that lake get there? And how did it disappear?
Right. Thank you. Tawny has a comment about our last question. She says, one of my mentors, historian Ned Brandt, said, be careful what you publish because it becomes truth.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it seems like we've come to the end of our questions, and I know you have another event to attend. Do you have any last wrap-up ideas after this discussion?
No, I'll just add one small point, one tip off. I actually, Brian Dunnigan at the Clements had sort of tipped me off to some of this thinking about maps in some of his discussions about disappearing islands in Lake Superior, which some of you may know. So I thought I would just plug your old colleague.
Yes, yes,
So
indeed.
thank you so much. This has been really a pleasure. And Angela, thank you for inviting me. So
Yes, thank you. This has been really interesting, and hopefully everybody has some good food for thought, and enjoy the rest of your day.
okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.